Friends, today we are going to start with a new essay. And this essay, which we are going to begin with, is written by Northrop Frye. And the title of the essay is The Archetypes of Literature. This essay, Archetypes of Literature, is written in a very famous book by Northrop Frye, which he wrote in 1957, titled The Anatomy of Criticism. This particular essay, if we, as we used to have different ages in understanding of literature or reading of literature, in the same fashion we have different sorts of various types of criticism, and we have taken various examples from those criticism when we have designed this particular curriculum. And as I said to you earlier also at the beginning of the lecture in the month of January, that while framing this curriculum for MA second year students, I have certain things in my mind and discussed with Professor Anand Ubade, because in next semester he is going to deal with critical theories. So before starting with critical theories, you should be familiar with all these developments. That's why we have started with this, and that's why we have taken first essay of Aristotle's Poetics, comes under the head of classical criticism. Then we have neoclassical criticism, where we are talking about Sir Philip Sidney. Then we have romantic criticism, where we are talking about Sir William Wordsworth. Then we moved, dropping Victorian criticism, we moved to modern criticism, where we discussed I. Richards's very famous essay, The Two Uses of Language. Then again dropping new criticism, where you will have J.C. Ransom, Cleon Brooks, or Wimsatt Birdsley. We have dropped this and we have taken the next one, archetypal and myth criticism, where you have Northrop Frye. And from then onwards, it starts with structuralism. Structuralism, Marxism, historicism, colonial, post-colonial studies, postmodernism, all those things comes afterwards. So this is how this particular essay comes under the category of archetypal and myth criticism, which is supposed to be the branch which is before the idea of structuralism. It has created a sort of framework for structuralism to initiate with. And the development of this myth and archetypal criticism, which was in vogue from 1940 to 1960, where various practitioners of this particular criticism, Richard Chase, Leslie Fielder, Philip Wainwright, and Northrop Frye, these are the major practitioners of this criticism. And Frye, especially, is dependent on the insights while framing the literature, while framing this critical approach. Northrop Frye is closely dependent on the insights which were revealed by anthropology, psychology, philosophy, religion, and linguistics. And this new category of criticism is seen at its best in the United States, where the new criticism, new critics insist upon the close study and explication of the text, which came up against the problems of language, its behavior, and which were explained in terms of interaction of imagery, metaphor, myth, and symbol. The new criticism, no doubt, enabled the reader to have deeper understanding and appreciation of a literary work, which, as a linguistic artifact, makes use of language in the non representational mode. The implication is that the language is itself a science, and science is referential, as we have discussed. And in it, the relation between image and idea or word and meaning is always clear, because we have seen that literary language is emotive, and this emotive language, which is used especially in poetry and pre-logical, because it is not having any, we cannot apply logic to it, as we have discussed it when we are talking about two uses of language with I. Richards. However, the new critics sought to find illustration of this pre-logical through a priori conception in the artistic work as is ambiguity. For them, there can be only one norm, and the norm itself is determined, priori deriving its authority from a particular poem, not from any sort of general philosophy. Now, against this, as new critics, they are interested in finding out the meanings of the text from itself. Against this, a myth and archetypal critique finds the structure of literary work in myth and archetypal images, drawing on the findings of anthropology and psychology regarding to the myths, rituals, folk tales. This myth and archetypal critique intended to restore spiritual and ruled by scientism, empiricism, positivism, and technology. Northrop Frye, a Canadian critic basically, and theorist who influenced modern criticism a lot when he wrote a book, The Anatomy of Criticism, from which the essay, The Archetypal of Literature, has been taken for our discussion. Broadly, this essay opens up with a question whether criticism is a coordinating principle, a central hypothesis, which, like the theory of evolution in biology, we'll see the phenomena it deals with as a part of whole. Though you will find out Fry exploits an analogy of art with biology. He aspires for a formal perfection so that literary criticism can be brought closer to science. Although seeming to achieve a condition of topographical reflection, which is not imagined in any form of literary study. Even you can say Fry's scheme did not even Fry's scheme did not even have this idea. But however, arouse a kind of deep-seated hostility and fear that is associated with the dramatic appearance of cultural theory in 1970s and in 1980s. You'll find out Northrop Frye's this static model that which we are going to discuss. We have not started it yet. But what exactly it means by archetypes of literature, we need to understand what exactly it comes from. So Fry's this static model exhibiting recurrence pattern is a feature which is later on shared by a structuralist view of language, literature, and even myth, which is exemplified by Claude Lévi-Strauss in his essay Insight and Myth. And then taking from Ferdinand de Saussure's concept of emphasis on linguistic features which describe the structures. Levi Strauss himself saw myth as a particular kind of language. So he uh, also stressed the deep structure underlying various phenomena and sometimes refer to these structures to the basic characteristics of human mind. So the further studies that we find it out in the field of criticism, in the field of understanding of language and literature, archetypal and myth criticism plays a very crucial and important role into it. And you can say this is why we have taken an essay which is part of close to the next development of criticism, that is structuralism. Now let us see what Northrop Frye discusses in this essay. According to Northrop Frye, every organized body of language, knowledge, every organized body of knowledge can be learned progressively. We are also learning this progressively, starting with classical criticism, Aristotle, moving slowly, gradually increasing, and in the next semester you are going to deal with the critical theories, which are the advanced version of those things. And experience shows that there is also something progressive about learning of literature also. This is what Northrop Frye is arguing. This is what Northrop Frye is pointing out. Naturally, this first statement, the first sentence, according to Northrop Frye, is having some sort of semantic difficulty. Because if you are saying every organized body of language can be learned progressively, so as learning of literature is also having a progressive mode. Now the question which comes in front of us is that what exactly we are learning in literature? What are we dealing with? Frye explained this very beautifully with a very interesting example. He said, physics is an organized body of knowledge which makes you to learn something about nature. And if you ask any student of physics what you are studying, the student will not answer that I'm learning nature. Although physics is nothing but an organized body of knowledge knowing something about nature, organized body of knowledge about nature. If you ask any student, he will not say you that he is studying nature. He'll say that he is studying physics. Now, art, like nature, is the subject of systematic study. And it has to be distinguished from the study itself. How will you distinguish? How will you come to know about certain poetry? How do you come to know about certain fiction? How do you come to know about certain drama where the things are there, but who made you to understand that there are six different parts of it? Plot, character, dialogue. Who makes you aware of all those things? When you study literature, you are studying the structure of that particular uh, genre. And when you start studying all those things, which you have to understand, and this understanding is possible simply because we learn all the things through criticism. There is always a question, and most of the time the students who have completed their post graduation not familiar exactly with what is that they studied, those students used to say that why we need criticism. Criticism is not for the sake of examination. Please understand this thing very clearly. Progressively, you have seen that how criticism is introduced to you. Criticism helps always to understand literature. And that's why Northrop Frye claimed that art, like nature, is the subject of systematic study and has to be distinguished from the study itself, which is criticism. And that's why it is Therefore, impossible to learn literature. One learns in one learns about literature in a certain way. A very basic question, if I ask that how you learn poetry, there is a certain way of learning poetry. There is a certain way to learn drama. There is a certain way to learn fiction. So there is a certain way. Fry is claiming, but what one learns is transitively the criticism of literature. What makes you to understand a poetry? With the help of criticism of literature, we can able to understand any literary work of art. Similarly, the difficulty often felt in teaching literature, which arises from the fact that it cannot be done. You cannot teach literature. What you teach? Have you ever seen that how we studied all those things? We are not simply talking about the plot. When the teacher is telling into the classroom that, okay, this is the story of this particular fiction, this is the story of this particular drama, this is the central theme of this particular poem. When the teacher is teaching, or when the student or when the learner is learning, you will find out, my friends, that they are not simply learning literature, they are not teaching literature, but they are dealing in criticism of literature that can be directly taught. Criticism of literature can be taught directly, through which we say that we learn literature, we teach literature. So while no one expects literature itself to behave like a science, there is surely no reason why criticism, as a systematic and organized study, should not be, or at least partly, a science. Because it is easy to understand the ideas, the concepts with sort of reference. If I go back to Richards's idea of scientific language and emotive language, for scientific language, you require references, as Richard says. Similar thing here, Northrop Frye is also mentioning that you require to have references, you require to have certain reasons, you have required to have certain ideas, and there is an organized structure through which you can able to teach literature, through which we can able to learn literature comfortably. Now, there is not a pure or exact science. There's no word like pure or exact. Perhaps what Fry claims that these phrases, pure and exact science, these phrases were from 19th century cosmology, which is not with us, which is not part of our study. Criticism deals with the arts and may well be something of an art itself. It is the criticism which defined the framework of genres. What is to be called as poetry? What is to be called as drama? We have seen that how Aristotle even also framed a framework for shifting from epic to tragedy. That means every literary genre, every literary work of art, or you can say any art, creative art, is understood by criticism, and criticism has made a particular framework in which you put that particular work of art so that we can able to understand it, so that we can able to learn it, and it is comfortable to teach it. How will you analyze a poem? How will you analyze a drama if you don't have a framework to analyze it? And when you have a framework, this framework was provided to us by criticism. So criticism is providing all those things, and that's why Northrop Frye is saying instead of treating it as a pure or exact science, it is a sort of science. And when you are drawing a framework, when you are mentioning a framework, when you are categorizing certain work of art into particular genre or category, then the thing which is categorizing them, the thing which is making them or putting them into a framework need to be systematic. You cannot have unsystematic framework to define or to decide anything. You want systematic framework. And if the systematic framework is there, then it will be easy to complete the process of learning and teaching and understanding of work of art, because work of art is something like what he says, physics is an organized body of language which discusses, which talks about nature. But when somebody asks that what you are learning, the student will not answer I am learning nature. He said I am learning physics. So when you are learning literature, you are learning literature through criticism. So you are not saying I'm criticism, I'm student of criticism. No, I'm student of literature, and literature is understood through criticism. And it need not to be deprived, because with the uh, grace of culture, with the graces of culture, you will find out it has been deprived of. It is deprived to be called as a science, and that's why the first claim made by Northrop Frye in Archetypes of Literature, that we need to accept the fact that criticism is a science, which is a systematic study, which is having its own framework, which helps us to understand literature, which helps us to learn literature, which helps us to teach literature. And that's why literature requires support of criticism, and criticism is the systematic knowledge, systematic organization of knowledge. Now, once we come to know about the systematic organization of knowledge, is criticism, through which we can understand, we can learn literature or art. Now, how it is produced? The second thing, how this is produced? Certainly, my friends, criticism, as we find it in learned journals and scholarly monographs has every characteristics of science. How will you come to know about criticism? Somebody wrote an essay. That essay was published in certain journal. There is certain monograph that is published there. When it is published, when it is, if you know the process of writing, because this year you have to submit a dissertation of 60 pages on one particular topic in the paper of research methodology when it comes for the fourth semester. If you are submitting a dissertation now, when you are writing something, how you are going to write down? There is a process, there is a methodology, and that's why we are studying research methodology. There is a method, and method means a scientific framework. So when the criticism, when the essay is appearing in any journal or appearing as a monograph, it has every characteristics of science. It requires evidences. And evidences is examined scientifically. Primary source, secondary source. The secondary source is taken from which particular thing. You have to give its bibliographical details. If bibliographical details are not correct, then it is considered to be plagiarism. You cannot copy someone's idea. You cannot take some other person's idea and frame it to be yours. It has got a scientific, it requires scientific evidences for that if you are claiming certain things. Like science, even in when you write an essay in criticism, when critics used to write down the essay, they used to mention that which previous authorities have used this and why it is stopped there and how you are proceeding further. How you are proceeding with this further, you have to explain it. You have to mention it very categorically. And that's why fields are investigated scientifically, texts are edited scientifically, prosody is scientific in structure, so is phonetics, so is philology. So when all these supportive things are part of scientific studies, then why not to consider, why not to accept that criticism is a science? It has got its own models, as you find it in science. The only difference is that you are not having a practical lab to approach practically to it. But you can able to have, you can have all these understandings. And yet, in studying this kind of critical science, the student becomes aware of centrifugal movement carrying him away from literature. Because most of the time, what people used to say that when you are applying too much criticism to it, you are getting away from the literature. You are not able to enjoy the literature. Right? Is pointing out very categorically this thing into this essay. He finds, student finds that literature is the central division of humanism, of humanities. Because it is a central division, Why it is central division? Because on one hand there is history, on other hand there is philosophy. Without the support of these two things, you are not able to get close to literature. If you remember Sir Philip Sidney's essay, where he is trying to bring out that philosophy and history are subsidiary to literature. Fry is also mentioning this thing that literature is a perfect central division of humanities, because humanities carries all these subjects, which we later on uh, nomenclatured as social sciences. Because again, you move to the word called science, where is a typical framework. So criticism, what Richards is trying to point out, what Richards is trying to mention it very pertinently, that criticism, so far as considered as a subdivision of literature, because we have not treated criticism as a scientific study which helps us to understand literature, which helps us to learn literature. It is always considered as subdivision of literature. And hence, you will find out, my friends, that if you want to understand something, you need to have, you require to have certain framework. Please understand this very important fact. When you say, I understand, I know, I learn anything. If you are learning driving a vehicle, you need to have a systematic study. Concept should be clear, the study should be clear too. If you are learning any poem, you should have a systematic study of it. Even when, if you are not student of a literature, if somebody is saying, okay, I only love to read poems, okay, if he's reading poems, what does the person is getting out of it? What is he getting out of that poem? He said, I'm getting pleasure after reading it. Now, for gaining pleasure, you need to have certain mode. Everything that you try to understand, try to learn, requires certain framework, certain mode, certain medium. You cannot understand it without having any framework for that. If you love certain kind of vegetable or certain kind of non-vegetarian food, you will not, if you say that I like chicken very much, okay, so you have to follow certain procedure to prove that you like it, that you have to bring it, you have to clean it, you have to wash it, you have to cook it, and cook it in a proper way, and then eat it, and then say that I am having the pleasure of eating non-vegetarian food or vegetarian food. Without cooking, if you put raw and say, okay, if you love chicken, eat, it is loved. No, there's a framework. There's a particular method. I like spinach. Okay, now the spinach is kept in front of you. Eat. No, you said no, it's a raw. It should go with a process. And then it should come in front of me, and then I love it to have. So when a poem comes in front of you, when a drama comes in front of you, or any form of literary work of art comes in front of you, you should have a certain process to understand it so that you can gain pleasure. You cannot say, I love poems, although I don't know the method of loving it. But you love, when you start loving it, there's certain framework that is in your mind, that is created. And that's what Fry is trying to point it out, that criticism is not subdivision of literature. Criticism is, because it is treated as subdivision of literature, the systematic mental organization of the subject. The student, if he is not getting a conceptual framework in literature, he will move to history. He will move to history to find out the conceptual framework. He will turn to conceptual framework of the historian for events or philosophers for the ideas. He will not able to understand literature by its own. That's why even Sir Philip Sidney pointed out that two things are not going to support, it is not going to make you a moral teacher. Poetry can make you a moral teacher, not history, not philosophy. But if it is treated that criticism, if criticism is treated as subdivision of literature, then the student, for sake of learning, for the sake of understanding, will surely turn to the conceptual framework of the historians for the events and for the philosophers for ideas. Even more centrally placed critical sciences, as such as textual editing seem to be the part of background that resides, that comes from history. Because when you try to edit certain things from literary work of art as an editor, if you don't have framework, you are going back to the frameworks of history to carry it out. Or some other non-literary field, framework of some other non-literary field. How will you edit? What is the framework you have? You don't have any specific framework for this. And that's why it is very much important to understand the fact that criticism should be treated as one of the important sciences to understand literature. Now, the thought, Fry says, suggests that the ancillary critical disciplines may be related to a central expanding pattern of systematic comprehension. These critical disciplines need to be related with a central expanding pattern of systematic comprehension. And Richard Fry says that which has not been established yet. This is what he is claiming in this essay. This expansion has not been established yet in critical sciences. And he says, but if it were established, it would prevent them from being centrifugal. If it were established at a proper time. But if such pattern exists, if such pattern is developed, If such pattern is in the center of understanding, of which you are getting all the things to be understand, to get to know, it would be like the criticism to the art, what philosophy is to wisdom, what history is to action. Similarly, criticism would be to the art. Because philosophy without wisdom is not possible to understand, and history without action is not complete in itself. In the same fashion, art is not going to be understood without criticism. This is what we need to understand. This is what we need to realize. And if we don't realize this fact, we are not able to understand literature from its own tools. And this is one of the reasons that Northrop Frye is trying to bring in front of us certain important discussions about archetypes, which defines literature. If you understand the archetype, you can able to understand literature. You can understand the art. You can understand the concepts. Because what is a common feelings about criticism nowadays is nothing but criticism. What it means by criticism, if somebody asks you without knowing, if you are not familiar with what exactly is scientific work and what sort of work criticism used to have and what sort of relation criticism is with literature, we used to say that criticism is nothing but uh, sort of commentary that is made on the particular piece of art. And we think that if commentary of that particular art is given to you, we used to call it as a criticism. Look out very interestingly in the market, you have the cheap market notes available to you, and you call it as a critical notes. Criticism is not mean by commentary. Criticism doesn't mean commentary. Criticism itself is a scientific study. And that's why Northrop Frye is trying to put it in such a way that we can able to understand, we can able to know that what exactly criticism is to literature. If the patterns were set, if the patterns were defined, then what philosophy to ideas, what history to events, history to action, in the same way criticism is to literature. So he tried to frame certain archetypes for us to understand literature that he has taken it from, because as I said you earlier, that archetypal criticism is nothing but taking the things from anthropology, psychology, linguistics, and all these different disciplines. I hope that you are able to understand what exactly how this is going on. We'll continue this discussion in tomorrow's lecture so that you can be able to understand what exactly it means by archetypal literature and what Northrop Frye is trying to put in front of us.